Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Package Tourist, hosted by yours truly, The Package Tourist, and the magical mystery tour called Life, Matthew DiBiase. Tonight's guest is sports author Clayton Trutor. Clayton holds a Ph.D. in U.S. history from Boston College and teaches at Norwich University in Northfield, Vermont. He writes about college football and basketball for SB Nation. Clayton is also the Vermont State Chairman of the Society of American Baseball Research and is a regular contributor to the SABR Biography Project. But tonight we will be talking about his future book release about legendary Auburn Tigers quarterback Pat Sullivan. Clayton, welcome back to the show. It's an honor and privilege to have you here. I'd like to start by asking you, what led you to write about Pat Sullivan?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure to come on the show. In terms of writing about Pat Sullivan, every year when the Heisman comes around, I get curious about the different anniversaries. Who won it 25 years ago? Who won it 50 years ago? And roughly 3 years ago now, it was the 50th anniversary of Pat Sullivan winning the Heisman in 1971. He was the first player from Auburn to win the Heisman Trophy, and I got interested in writing about him. I'd read about his life a little bit and knew he'd had an extensive battle with cancer, so I was curious about honoring him in a story. Initially, it started out as a writing about Pat Sullivan started out as a story for a magazine in Birmingham, but they ended up passing on the story once I'd written it, and later I found a home for the story Next Avenue, which is a publication through PBS, public television. So it was really from the 50th anniversary of his Heisman that I got interested in his story, both him as a player and then also as a man. Okay.
How long did it take you to write this book, Clayton?
Well, I mean, it's just an extensive article at this point. It's probably, there's a published 1,000-word piece, and I have another longer 5,000 or 6,000-word piece that I'm looking for a home for. I'm trying to figure out the right venue. It was probably a 3-week process. I interviewed probably, about 8 or 9 people about Sullivan, people who knew him personally, people who could comment on him in a more historical sense. Spoke with two of his children, many of his teammates, and people who'd known him throughout his career. So I read up on him, just got all the articles I could find about Pat Sullivan, read them, and then spoke quite extensively with a lot of people. People were able to speak quite personally about him and in great detail about his life and his personality. I really hope I was able to, in my longer piece, create a vivid portrait of the man, because he was a very interesting guy and a man with many passions that he pursued with great vitality. I think he was a genuine humanitarian, a term that may be overused, but I think that certainly accounts for him, both in terms of the way he dealt with his fans and the way he served his community, particularly through his own struggles with cancer.
Okay, let's begin in the beginning. Where was Pat Sullivan born and raised?
Pat Sullivan was born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama, on the west side of town. Grew up in a blue-collar household, 3-generational household. As he shared, like, his basement, he shared with his grandparents. Grew up in the same room with him in the basement, and was a high school football star there, and then ended up going to Auburn.
Okay, why did he choose Auburn, considering the fact he was in Alabama? Was he heavily recruited by other universities? Why did he choose Auburn?
I think he chose Auburn primarily because of his relationship with their coach, Shug Jordan, who he really hit it off well with. I think in Alabama, for one thing, was very quickly a lot of competition for the role of quarterback there, with Bryant turning him very quickly into a power. Auburn was certainly second fiddle for much of the 60s and 70s, and it was certainly a chance to play almost immediately, and he developed very much a father-son type relationship with Jordan, the coach at Auburn as well.
Now, did Shug Jordan have to retailor his offense to accommodate Pat Sullivan's abilities or anything like that? Did he have to do any recalibration? Was it a pass-oriented offense? What was it like?
I think it evolved over time. He played in the era when freshmen could not play on varsity, and he was a starter from the time he was a sophomore. And slowly but surely, over the course of his sophomore year, they became more passing-oriented. And also, before it became commonplace, he was a guy who was a passing quarterback who also showed a great deal of mobility. This wasn't like a guy who ran the wishbone, who ran the ball in that sense. He ran it more as a quarterback who would scramble, more almost like a Fran Tarkenton type quarterback in that era. Sullivan was very much a dual threat quarterback who was at his core a drop back kind of passer rather than somebody from a very wishbone or option oriented offense. So I think slowly over time they made use of his arm strength and athleticism to build an offense that suited him well, and he had great weapons around him too.
Did Pat Sullivan play in any college bowl games?
Yeah, he played bowl games throughout his career. He played in the Sugar Bowl. He played in the Gator Bowl. He was very successful in those games. In some ways, the biggest game of his career he lost right after he'd won the Heisman Trophy. Auburn was undefeated and was probably headed for a national title, but was defeated by Alabama in the Iron Bowl. So he was a Gator Bowl MVP. He was very successful in bowl games, but in that one instance he came up short.
Did he ever win any Iron Bowls against Alabama or no?
No, he won his sophomore and junior year, but then lost his senior year.
Oh, wow. Okay. What was it that made him the great quarterback that he was?
I think he had great intelligence for one thing. His teammates spoke of his on-field awareness, his willingness to watch film before that was really commonplace. He was very dedicated to his craft from an early age. He also had great skill as a quarterback. He had a strong arm. He ran well. He was a very physically powerful guy. He really had all the attributes coming together in one person. And it served him certainly well, ending up being a Heisman Trophy winner.
When it came to the Heisman Trophy voting, was it a close vote, or did he win overwhelmingly? Do you recall what was the margin of his victory in the Heisman Trophy stakes?
He won fairly substantially that year. It was not a particularly close race, as several in that era were.
Okay. What was he good academically? Was he more than just an athlete? Was he pretty versatile?
Oh yeah, he was an academic All-American. Yeah, he was a fantastic student, fantastic. I believe he was a business major. He was fantastic on the field and as a player too. He was the president of his fraternity. He was a leader on campus and on the football field, certainly.
Okay. Now, who drafted him in the NFL?
He was selected by the Atlanta Falcons, which was a very natural choice. Auburn is roughly 80 miles from Atlanta. Auburn and Georgia famously is the oldest college football rivalry in terms of the number of games played, in part because they're so close. They're roughly equidistant from Atlanta. But it never really worked out there. The Falcons it was a very difficult era for them. He was bounced around the league as a backup for 5 or 6 years. Steve Bartkowski ends up getting that starting job there eventually and going on to a very successful career. But he never really got it rolling as a pro. And I think a lot of it, like it is for so many young quarterbacks, is context. What's going on around him? They were certainly in rebuild mode, the Falcons, when he got there, and it showed.
Did he have a good relationship with head coach Norm Van Brocklin or no?
I think he got along fine with every coach he dealt with. Van Brocklin was a very difficult guy to get along with. He choked reporters, fought reporters throughout his career, fought guys on his team. He was obviously a very talented player and a very knowledgeable guy about football, but I think maybe not the most emotionally and socially adept guy from my perceptions of him.
Okay. Now, when did his NFL career end? What season was that when it ended?
I think it was 1978, I think was his final NFL season.
Okay, 77, 78. Okay. What did he do afterwards? How was this transition into regular life?
I think it took him a while to figure it out. He did the radio for Auburn football for a while. He sold tires for a while. Was in the insurance business for a little bit. He got into coaching eventually, and I think that really was his calling overall after his football career. He was the quarterbacks coach at Auburn for much of the late 1980s. Eventually, he takes over at TCU and is incredibly successful. He wins a share of the last Southwestern Conference title in '94. Eventually struggles there, but in his final season, even though TCU had a losing record, he recruited a running back named LaDainian Tomlinson, who ended up doing pretty well. He coaches at UAB for a little bit, in his hometown of Birmingham. Where he does the best, though, is at the 1AA level, coaching at Samford, which is also in Birmingham. They had just moved up from D2 to 1AA when he coached there, and made them a very very strong, very successful team who made the 1AA playoffs, later FCS playoffs a bunch of times under him. And during his tenure at Stanford is when he started to deal with throat cancer. He's a guy who chewed tobacco his whole life, for much of his life.
Yeah.
And he had a 10-year battle with cancer. Much of that time period, he remained the coach at Stanford for it. When I spoke with his kids, they spoke extensively about just the physical struggles he had to go through to keep coaching during that time period, just all of the different apparatuses he had to use and the treatments he had. But what a gift it was for his family to be able to coach for many of those years. He had his grandchildren were able to be his ball boys and stuff for his teams. He was able to live that long enough. He died in 2019, but had a very successful college coaching career. Was an incredibly devoted family man, by all accounts, a wonderful friend. And everyone I spoke with said he had time for everyone who came up to him. That he was one of the most famous people in the state of Alabama. And anywhere he went, people would come up to him and stop him and want to shake his hand or get his autograph or take a picture with him or just chat with him. And he had lots of time for everybody throughout his career.
Tell me, wasn't his uniform number retired by Auburn? And when did that take place? When his uniform was his uniform number was retired?
He was retired not that long after his playing career. He was still a pro athlete at the time, and he ended up having a statue at Jordan-Hare Stadium there too, as they do with each of their Heisman winners, with Bo Jackson and Cam Newton as well. He remains as revered a figure to Auburn people. He's as revered as anybody who ever played for the Tigers. I mean, certainly Bo and Cam Newton are better known now, in part because of their closer proximity in time. But to the Auburn community, there's no one they're more devoted to than Pat Sullivan.
Would it be accurate to say he was they consider him the greatest Auburn Tiger quarterback of all time?
I mean, I think now you could either say either him or Cam would be I think you could argue it either way. But probably it's a generational thing a little bit. Younger fans, I think, would probably say Cam Newton. Yeah. And also there's a lot more footage of him. And he was such a spectacular player. It's hard to argue against him. I think older fans would go with Pat Sullivan for that. But I think until Bo and Cam come around, he is the best player in the history of Auburn football. And in terms of quarterbacks, I think it's a toss-up between him and Cam Newton.
Okay. How long was he married? How many kids did he have?
He had 3 kids. He got married in college. He lived in married student housing when he was a junior in college. Married his high school sweetheart, and has had a bunch of grandkids and a very tight knit, close family who was incredibly helpful when I worked on the piece. Okay.
What do you think? What was it that made him the great coach that he was, especially at Stanford, where you said he had maximum impact? What do you think were his greatest attributes as a head coach?
One of the people I talked to said he was just a great delegator. He knows head coaches try to do everything. He had his skill set. He made use of that. He was able to find great people to work with who he developed relationships over the course of his career, and had a very consistent and steady coaching staff. Many of the people he coached with at Stanford were there for his entire run there. There were people who'd come from his time at TCU, from his time at UAB. So he created a large group of potential assistants from the people he coached and also from Auburn that he was able to bring along with him.
Clayton, what do you envision? What do you consider to be your next book project? What are you thinking of working on, and when will you expect its release?
I have a few ideas in mind. I've been talking with my agent about which way to go. Part of me wants to. I've been writing for the Hockey News a fair amount recently, and part of me wants to do a hockey book, kind of a large scale kind of project, similar to Loserville, big scope over time of a city or of the league as a whole over a period of time. I've thought about doing some biographies. I'm not exactly sure yet, but I hope to get going on a book project soon. I've been doing mostly freelance stuff, just individual pieces for a lot of different city and regional magazines. Been doing stuff for PBS, for Next Avenue. Been writing for the Hockey News. For a while, I was writing for American History magazine, but they went out of business, unfortunately. I'm just starting to write for Costco Connections, which is a very different kind of thing, but I write for a lot of different venues, and hope to keep finding homes for my pieces. Generally, I write about sports or music or film, usually some aspect of popular culture. It's what I guess is my most comfortable area for writing, and hope to keep doing it as long as people keep hiring me to do so.
Would you be thinking of writing about the Atlanta Flames when they were playing in Atlanta, or are you tempted by that, or no?
Oh, I mean, I have a fair amount about the Atlanta Flames in Loserville. Yeah, I would certainly be interested in writing about them some more. I think they're a fascinating story. I think the success they had in town is incredibly underappreciated. I mean, they really drew quite well for much of their time in Atlanta. It was really broader forces which led to their demise. I mean, their owner had gotten to financial trouble because of some of the real estate deals he got into, and there was a lot of money in Alberta from oil men who were willing to invest in the team, so it led to their very quick departure. I don't think it's really a commentary on the Flames' success in town. They really performed pretty well on the ice and drew pretty well for most of their history as well. I think as far as teams leaving, it's a fairly tragic story because considering just how on an island they were compared to the rest of the league, it really went quite well for most of the 8 years in town. So yeah, I'd certainly be tempted to write about them again. I enjoyed talking with some of their former players when I worked on the book, who universally enjoyed their time in town and found it a great place to live and enjoyed their experience there.
You know, when I was working on my second book, The Art of the Dealers, I interviewed Flames GM Cliff Fletcher, and we talked about those early years there. You know, he found some really good players there. I mean, he drafted very well, got some real, hot talents there, and that's one of the reasons why the Flames were able to be playoff contenders pretty much in the early part, of their existence there. It just, thing is, they just couldn't advance. That was the tragedy of it all, and all that, But have you ever interviewed Cliff Fletcher?
I wasn't able to talk to him. I admire him tremendously. I think he's one of the great general managers in the history of pro sports. I mean, how quickly he got things going. I mean, he learned at the feet of Sam Pollock in Montreal and was able to get a lot of great players out of the Montreal system that he'd seen up there. I mean, Bouchard and Phil Meyer and a lot of the guys who were great contributors early on were guys who come from the Montreal feeder system, and he did a great job and helped build the '89 Flames Stanley Cup team as well. He's a fantastic GM.
Yeah, Trader Cliff. I mean, he was visionary. I mean, like in the 80s when he was in Calgary, he started tapping into American collegiate hockey, just signing guys up, they were studs in NCAA, and he was just signing them as free agents. Sometimes he drafted them, but most of the time he just signed them as free agents. It was a steal, a virtual steal.
Yeah, I think the word you use, visionary, is correct for him, certainly. I mean, there's a lot of guys who are just, there's so much groupthink in all of the leagues, and I think that it almost is, it's almost necessary for there to be a certain degree of that in those leagues as teams try to hang in there and compete. But somebody who's able to be as far-sighted as he was really was able to break out from the mold.
Clayton, I want to thank you so much for appearing on the show, and let me know when your next book comes out, because I want you on my show again, okay?
Oh, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for the great questions. It's always a fun conversation.
You take care. Thank you.
All right, take care.
Okay, bye-bye. Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, for my next show will be this coming Tuesday, where I'll be interviewing Rich Schmetler about his new release on the 1964 Cleveland Browns. Thank you, and good night.